Yes. Okay, so we can start. Hello, everyone.
Hello. I'll start with a small introduction. First of all, welcome to the workshop of the Moscow Center for Cultural Sociology at the Higher School of Economics. And my name is Dmitry Kurakin. I'm the chair of this workshop. And today is our first workshop. And there's probably no better way to start such a workshop as ours, as with the lecture given by Professor Jeffrey Alexander. But before he starts, I'm going to say a couple of words about how it all going to work, the workshop, and about Professor Alexander himself. So first of all, I'd like to say that this workshop is designed in a very peculiar way. So it is, I think it's not like many other workshops. So this is truly collective work. So even though each particular workshop has a leading person who is giving a lecture or submitting a paper we're going to discuss, this is going to be very intense collective work. And this work will be done by a permanent group. This group will be permanent throughout the year, for the whole academic year. And this year, we were, for our first season, we were able to gather an amazing team of bright cultural sociologists from various countries. You can check our team on the website of the workshop. I encourage you to do that. You also can look into each of us and go to our university webpage, check on our publications, things like that. But I think this is a very strong team, and we have a very fruitful season. So what is going to happen? We're going to meet once a month, and following the names of the month, we're going to call it September edition of our workshop, October edition of our workshop, and so on. And mostly our basic activity would be to discuss a text submitted by one of the fellows of the workshop. This text should be unpublished, but very close to the final stage. So it's close to submission to an academic journal. And what is fascinating about that format, I think, is that it reveals what is normally hidden, because this is a very important part for in work of every researcher, like finalizing the final draft of the paper and submitting it to the journal. But normally it's kind of hidden. So we rarely have a chance to discuss it in details. We rarely have a chance that such a relatively big company of very competent cultural sociologists would read this text closely and discuss it. So I think this is of particular interest for any researcher, including students and PhD students who see themselves in academia in the future. And because of that, we're going to broadcast it every hour workshop on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. So join us. I think it's going to be interesting. And in addition to that, we decided to add 4 lectures from distinguished scholars, from distinguished cultural sociologists, 4 lectures during an academic year. And because it's 4 of them, we decided again to call it after the times of the season. So this first one is going to be the autumn lecture given by Professor Jeffrey Alexander. Jeffrey Alexander is one of the most famous and significant contemporary sociologists, so he doesn't really need to be introduced. For example, in Russia, we have a lot of papers translated. We have his book, Meanings of Social Life, translated into Russian, and we even have an interview with him published in Russian about his life and career, so we can read it. So instead of that, I just wanted to briefly comment on 2, I think, very interesting things about him. And Jeff is undoubtedly a very much American sociologist. So to understand his theory, to understand his work, you need to understand the general context of American life. And I think you will be able to see it even in today's lecture. But on the other hand, he he's very different from the most of American sociologists, at least in two very important regards. First of all, American sociology is known to have a strong bias toward empirical work. And it's hard to be a theorist in the United States. And Jeff has always been very deep theorist. And he started his work from the well-known 4-volume book, Theoretical Logic in Sociology. And actually, he published it very early in his career. And I think that even if he would stop immediately after that, he would be still famous today because of this 4-volume. And this is purely theoretical work. And it's not like in countries like Russia or Germany, where theoretical work in sociology are regarded very high. It's probably easier to be a theorist. But Jeff managed to do it successfully in the United States and in the American context. And the second very important thing about Jeff is this. So people often say that contemporary international sociology is basically an American sociology. So international sociology is getting Americanized, and it's more and more American. In a paradoxical way, however, American sociology is not international. So Americans are very much oriented inward in terms of sociology, except Jeff. Jeff is very different in this regard. Not only he is well known around the world, he also puts a lot of energy, ideas, and direct support into various cultural sociological centers around the world, including ours, of course, but not only. But he also supports centers in Italy, Czech Republic, Norway, Sweden, Israel, many countries, and he supports individual researchers. And this influence is very important for many researchers and very supportive for many researchers. And one single example would be his work on his civil sphere theory, which he disseminated, which initially was developed based on American material, but then he was able to disseminate it towards the many other contexts. And he was able to invite a lot of cultural sociologists from around the world. And they published few books covering civil sphere theory and the related problems in East Asia, in Latin America, in Northern Europe. So this is, I think, very, very remarkable way to use not only your energy and ideas, but also your reputation. And this is a very fruitful way of investment, I think, which is very much characteristic of the Jeff. And here I'm coming to our own workshop because I think it was very important, and we appreciated a lot that Jeff and another Yale professor, Philip Smith, supported us. They supported us directly by agreeing to be senior fellows of this workshop, which obviously attracted a lot of attention to our initiative. But also they actually did a lot to create the design of the whole workshop, because the initial initiative was mine, but then they helped me a lot of designing it, to making it better. And if it goes wrong, it's only my fault, but it's definitely their merit in it. So thank you so much. And Jeff, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dmitry. It's great to start this this Moscow cultural sociology workshop off. I'm honored. I'm excited to see the growth. I've met some of Dmitry's colleagues in Moscow and elsewhere in Russia, and it's obviously a good place to do cultural sociology. I'm going to present this today. It's written as a chapter of a book, not as an article. And that means that you can't criticize it because it's completely, it's not supposed to stand by itself, but in relationship to other things. No, I will welcome your criticism. So let me begin. Human beings experience nature as a quintessential material object, the very embodiment of the an sich, the in itself that contrasts with für sich, a subject that can be for itself. Nature seems to have its effect by virtue of its most decidedly not being human or even humanly constructed. For example, it's a material object like architecture, painting, or sculpture might be humanly constructed, although they're still objects. So in this lecture, I want to develop an alternative to this point of view. I want to begin with the statement that cultural meanings are sociologically relative and that aesthetic experiences are conventionalized and particular. Just as speech, parole can be formed only from within an already existing language, along, so the surface and depth of natural objects are filtered through structured background representations that provide aesthetic conventions and social meanings. For most of human history, the falling of an autumn leaf was neither aesthetically compelling nor existentially poignant. It required what the cultural geographer William Cronin has called a revolution in consciousness to make it seem so. What the literary historian Marjorie Hope Nicholson described as one of the most profound revolutions in thought that has ever occurred, and what social historian Keith Thomas described as a major change in human perception. For most of the Christian era, the natural world was experienced as wretched and decaying, filled with thorns and thistles, rooted in stony and barren soil, peppered with hostile forests that blocked light and prevented cultivation, spotted with inhospitable, barren, and gloomy mountains that blocked human happiness and progress. God had created nature for human use, but after the fall and their exit from the Garden of Eden, men and women labored by the sweat of their brows to squeeze from nature their livelihoods. Forests were made to be cleared, soil to be cultivated, and mountains to be bypassed or cut through. In the centuries between 1500 and 1800, however, all of this changed. Trees became worshipped, flowers and rocks sacred, and mountains glorious and awe-inspiring. I'm talking about the West. Yet, if the background representations to which moderns experience natural objects were radically transformed, the social actors who lived and worked, explored, and recreated inside the framework of this cultural revolution very rarely understood natural experience as filtered through their own subjectivity. Rather, they attributed the sacrality of nature to the effect of its material elements, which they believed were external to themselves. It was the natural object that was sacred, not the background representations that informed human experience of it. In everyday life, of course, we do experience objects as things outside us. It, something outside ourselves, is that, something that has qualities in itself. But this experience is deeply misleading. Natural objects are icons, and they have to be performed into being. To think otherwise ignores the dynamic of materialization and subjectification. We materialize our subjectivity, embedding our experience in material objects, bringing a generalized cultural language to bear on something tactile. an object that already exists or we are making ourselves. At the same time, as we materialize our subjectivity, we subjectify an already existing object world, bringing it inside ourselves from the outside. Nor are we monads who experience the world by ourselves. We are involved in a performative process, scripting an object and projecting it toward an audience with the means of symbolic production at hand, via clothing, facial expression, and speech, via travelogues, documentaries, painting, sculpture, poetry, novels, fiction, films, and academic writing. These processes of projecting to audiences can be conceived as mise en scène. We are putting our self-created objects into the scene, projecting a materialized object for others to experience and subjectify in turn. Is our performance successful? Can we persuade others to experience the natural objects we've created as we have intended? To subjectify our objects as we have objectified our own subjectivity, to make signifieds of these objects in reference to the same set of signifiers. This was precisely the challenge facing those who traveled through nature to write about it and paint it from the late 18th through to the end of the 19th century. The sacralizing and beautifying language of nature was already in the air, established before they set out. Their challenge, after experiencing nature themselves, was to perform it for the audiences at hand. While these performers scripted nature, they did not, of course, actually design it. Rather, they attributed designs to its surfaces. And after inscribing nature's objective surfaces, they associated natural objects via metaphor, simile, and painted image with purity and morality, assuring audiences that if they went into nature, they could escape from the depredations of modern civilization and know the real meaning of the sacred, a more pure personal and social life. The paradox is that even as these sophisticated thinkers and artists designed and projected nature to elite and mass audiences, they themselves essentialized it, claiming that it was nature's own material form en sich in itself that triggered ecstatic sensations and moral salvation, not their own performative efforts to make nature seem so. These century-spanning performances of iconic nature emerged first in European Romanticism, and the texts and images of such figures as Rousseau, Wordsworth, Ruskin, Turner, von Humboldt were the ground base for the American productions that I will focus on in this talk. Indeed, iconic nature played a more outsized role in the New World than the Old. No American was more central to the national performance of iconic nature than Ralph Waldo Emerson. This extraordinarily prodigious essayist presented himself as a cerebral philosopher and has been hallowed in American history as the sage of Concord, Massachusetts being where he lived, who in fact created the first distinctively American philosophy, transcendentalism, the philosophy that preceded the second distinctive American philosophy of pragmatism. For reasons of time, however, I am going to have to bracket any discussion of Emerson, which I do in this chapter, and move directly to one of Emerson's greatest performative accomplishments, which was to have produced the great naturalist, Henry David Thoreau. Prepared by the romanticizing culture of his time, Thoreau had intensely experienced iconic nature in childhood and youth, but it was Ralph Waldo Emerson's famous commencement address to Thoreau's graduating class at Harvard College that persuaded Thoreau to jettison the family pencil trade and follow his future mentor into the vocation of naturalist. 25 years after that, in Emerson's sweeping eulogy at his disciple's funeral, Thoreau died young, he praised Thoreau for having dedicated his genius to the acute observation, in quotes, of fields, hills, and water. Quote, he saw as with a microscope, Emerson said, heard as with an ear trumpet, and his memory was a photographic register of all he saw and heard. Despite his strange claim that his younger disciple lacked lyric facility and technical skill, Emerson insisted that Thoreau, quote, knew well how to throw a poetic veil over his experience of nature, thus pointing to the style of creative performance that would eventually allow Thoreau's writings to become vastly more influential than Emerson's own. The foundation, indeed, for what Lawrence Buell would call more than a century later, quote, the modern environmental imagination. Buell says Thoreau's work was the foundation of the modern environmental imagination. Now, it's tempting to say that Thoreau, by reason of his famous personal asceticism and his inattention to fortune and fame, paid no attention to the gap between the sacrality of natural objects and their human effect, and that he wasn't at all concerned with performatively bridging that gap. Yet, if this were so, why did Thoreau spend so much of his adulthood writing about nature instead of simply experiencing it? Thoreau did not embark on his strenuous weeks-long wilderness excursions, much less his years living on the banks of Walden Pond in Massachusetts, simply for his own self-purifying delectation. He went into nature rather as the first act of a social performance, to gain searing natural experiences that could be transformed into written texts and sent out into the wider world. Thoreau, in fact, may well have been the first popular writer to have fully appreciated the organic ecology of natural life, which is what many biologists claim, and he certainly devoted hundreds of published pages to rather dry and detailed descriptions of the life and times of flora and fauna. But the icon-producing ambition of his authorial performances always eventually revealed itself. The surface beauty of nature evocatively described, the depth of its morality seriously attested. Now, Thoreau presented his nature writing not as iconic scripting, but rather as truthful observation. His early Katahdin essay about a mountain, I believe in Vermont, evocatively demonstrates how he experienced nature as entirely divorced, from human subjectivity. Quote, I climbed alone over huge rocks, Thoreau writes, describing them as the raw materials of a planet. Quote, this was an undone extremity of the globe. It was vast, titanic, and such as man never inhabits, inhuman and primeval, untamed and forever untamable nature. Here was no man's garden, but the unhandled globe. It was not a lawn, nor pasture, nor mead, nor woodland, or sea, nor arable, nor wasteland. It was the free and natural surface of the planet Earth. It was matter, vast and terrific. Yet it is precisely here that Thoreau begins to tell a story, to weave his observations of nature into a narrative about the salvation of the social world. Thoreau declares that the objective quality of nature, its ontological realness, gives observers access to a deeper moral and metaphysical reality. And he scripted a deeply personal story about experiencing the desiccation of nature in his own lifetime. When, as a young boy, I first paddled a boat on Walden, he writes, it was completely surrounded by thick and lofty pine and oak woods, and in some of its coves, grapevines had run over the trees next to the water, et cetera, et cetera. But by the time of his adulthood, he writes, everything was beginning to be ruined. Since I left Walden shores, the wood choppers have laid them to waste. And for many a year, there will be no rambling through the aisles of the wood with occasional vistas through which you can see the water. My muse will be excused if she is silent henceforth. How can you expect birds to sing when the groves are cut down? Yet Thoreau did describe the birds of Walden as singing, crafting a powerful story about his purifying experience at Walden. He challenged industrial civilization, which he hated, by projecting his famous book, Walden, or Life in the Woods, throughout the land. Walden Pond becomes, in his work, the protagonist of a salvation narrative. Quote, of all the characters I have known, Thoreau explains, Walden wears best because it, quote, best preserves his purity. Though the wood choppers have laid bare first this shore and then that, and the Irish have built their sties by it, and the railroad has infringed on its border, and the iceman have skimmed it once, it is itself unchanged, the same water which my youthful eyes fell on. It has not acquired one permanent wrinkle after all of its ripples. It is perennially young. It is the same liquid joy. This pond has rarely been profaned. Walden became not only something natural, in other words, but something literary, a character in a great work of the poetic imagination. To root one's feet in the rocky mud bottom of reality requires immersing oneself not in a material object, but in an aesthetic envelope that covers the material object via a text so powerful that it compels one to identify with Walden Pond as a character that can slay the dragons of modern life. It is aesthetic performance, not the actual experience of nature, that informs Thoreau's great book. During his stay at Walden, in fact, Thoreau worked furiously on his writing, making Walden as physical entity into, quote, Walden, the protagonist, in his elaborately crafted story, which impressed the experience of nature much more forcefully upon Americans than their own actual experience of nature itself. What Thoreau describes on Walden's first page is, quote, a simple and sincere account of my own life, was revised 7 times before its eventual publication, many years after he left the pond. In fact, the author's aesthetic concerns were so painstaking that he inserted more than 1,000 revisions in the printer's typescript just before publication, at great expense to himself. And during that same Walden reclusion, when he describes himself as simply being inside of the material object of nature, he also revised and polished another major work, the manuscript for A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which was published 20 months later. He also left Walden to deliver the Carlyle lectured at the Concord Lyceum during the first months of his stay at the pond. And in the months after, he gave public lectures from early sections of his developing Walden manuscript. In other words, he was a very, very busy person, kind of like an academic promoting his work all over his world, which shows what was his literary ambition to transform his experience, to project it to others, to convince them to experience nature in a certain way. With the success of Walden, Thoreau's public lectures were widely reviewed. For example, the lecture at the Lyceum, this was a major form of communication in those days, in newspapers and magazines, and created a wide audience for his writing. And throughout the rest of his life, he maintained continuous and sometimes highly wrought correspondence with editors at America's leading magazines, which published his work as articles before they appeared in books. We might call this access to the means of symbolic production for his performances. And they constituted a dense network of influential friends, including, for example, a man named Horace Greeley, who was America's most ambitious and famous abolitionist and publisher of a highly influential newspaper, the New York Herald Tribune. In other words, there was a lot more going on than a spiritual guy sitting on Walden Pond in nature. But Emerson had first worked to inscribe on America's collective consciousness. And what Thoreau tried to embed in the minds and hearts of future generations, a man named John Muir succeeded in bringing down to earth, transforming nature writing into best-selling middlebrow culture. Admired as intrepid explorer of Western mountains, glaciers, and valleys, Muir's extraordinary fame actually derived from his ability to popularize a genre of writing, the very one that Thoreau had first created. Muir had emigrated from Scotland to America only a few years after Thoreau's death, when industrial society's impact on nature was much more obviously disastrous than when the New Englander, Thoreau, had taken up his work. While Thoreau had interpreted nature as sacred and held it dear against the pollution of industrial civilization, he had never questioned its continuing existence. Presupposing what Buell calls the mythical narrative of nature's inexhaustibleness that mesmerized many of the astutest 19th century minds. Muir's own experience of nature was completely different. As he transformed this experience into writing, there was always in the background a haunting anxiety about nature's dwindling amidst America's extraordinary post-Civil War industrial expansion. The problem was not only that nature was in danger of rapidly disappearing, as it is today. I think that Muir's writing marks the beginning of this, but that most Americans didn't seem to give a damn. The love of nature, quote, the love of nature among Californians is desperately moderate, Muir confided to a prominent New York publisher in 1890. That same year, introducing his elegy to the Grand Canyon, one of his most famous essays, Muir recounted how, upon learning that the Santa Fe Railroad now ran right up to the canyon's edge, he was, quote, troubled with thoughts of the disenchantment likely to follow with the inundation of, quote, the tourist. Those, quote, tender, pulpy people who had, quote, slaves making everything easy for them and may now go almost everywhere in smooth comfort. When he himself actually entered the canyon, however, Muir was reassured, quote, I was glad to discover that in the presence of such stupendous scenery, they are, the tourists, are nothing. Nature's aesthetic delight and the moral purification this sensation triggered, the depth for the surface, was still very much there for Muir. Nature was too powerful a material force, he believed, not to impress itself upon human beings. Indeed, even as, quote, the most experienced will be awestruck by the vast extent of the canyon's huge rock monuments, Muir deploys such verbs as, now I want to, let me start over. What I want to emphasize is that Muir employs verbs like observe, watch, gazing, and looking. Nature is not a language, not a set of conventions, but real stuff that is there for those who have the courage to go out and see. But here's a conundrum. Nature is an object for Muir that directly and powerfully affects the senses, yet it seems that those living inside industrial civilization do not respond to this object. Hence the gap, the distance between object and audience that it was Muir's lifelong ambition to bridge. He would do so, as had Emerson and Thoreau before him, by becoming an actor-author, one who created literary objects inside of which natural objects were scripted and project both of these to distant audiences. During his Scottish youth, Muir had imbibed the romantic writings of such poets as Robert Burns and William Wordsworth, who had powerfully crystallized revolution in natural consciousness that had begun centuries before. So the background representations that would inform Muir's own symbolic material productions were already inside of his head before he ever set foot on American shores. In his first book, The Mountains of California, nature becomes a central character, or the central character. It's a grammatical subject that is placed by Muir before active verbs that describe the doing of beauty. So rivers sing, water is singing, these are all quotes. Winds flow in melody, rocks glow, streams rejoice and dance, and birds make a delightfully pure and tranquil music. While these verbs are intransitive, they provide nature with what Muir called an expressive outspokenness that makes its character powerful enough to fuse with readers. Nature has taken great pains, Muir writes, to gather her choicest treasures in order to draw her lovers into close and confiding communion with her lovers being human beings. Creating objects, quote, in endless variety of fragrance and color, compelling the admiration of every observer and enabling us to feel something of nature's love. Ostensibly describing nature as object, in other words, Muir is actually describing it as icon. Nature is, quote, a sculpture with an aesthetically compelling surface, one that is, quote, charming, glowing golden in the sun, gloriously colored with a luminous look. Nature has, quote, colored belts blending smoothly that make a wall of light ineffably fine, as beautiful as a rainbow, with, quote, glorious floods of light that create sunbursts of morning among the icy peaks, the noonday radiance on the trees and rocks and snow, and the flush of alpine glow. And there is much, much more along these lines. So this is his aesthetic creation, I'm arguing, of the aesthetic surface of the natural object. It's not just a description. It's an act of artistic creation using the aesthetic conventions of his time to create an image in the reader's minds of an aesthetically compelling object. But at every point in this iconic rendering, Muir is also careful to emphasize that California mountains also possess moral depth, that, quote, the rocks are telling a grand story. The story is not about raw and gloomy, jagged gorges that seem savage and inaccessible. It is rather about mountains whose meanings are, quote, glorifying and, quote, mighty, grandest and most telling, celestial, free and unconfusing, with, quote, thoughtful rocks and, quote, calm nights. These are all descriptions, are all moral descriptions of certain moral capacities and states of mind. For Muir, the mountains, quote, seem to kindle a rapt religious consciousness and stand hushed and waiting like devout worshipers. The iconic discourse Muir established in his first book, which was published quite a few years after he began publishing in local and national outlets. This iconic discourse structured his literary performances for the rest of his life. Muir transformed his personal experiences of nature into lyrical and inspiring descriptions of nature as an iconic object, one that took center stage in narrative accounts of his heroic explorations. And these literary performances fused with the American audience, uplifting and often electrifying citified readers who worried that they were being polluted by the ugly banalities of citified life. You are one of the true poets, one reader enthused, writing to Muir from his Grain Commission office in Chicago, Illinois, early in Muir's literary career. I would there were more such in our world, he wrote. In this heavy material age, we are too often blind and deaf to the sights and sounds of nature. Her harmonies seem to be recognized by few. 25 years later, near the end of Muir's career, another grateful reader, this one from Portland, Oregon, testified that by connecting him with nature, Muir's writing allowed him to stay alive. Quote, we who are not able to keep in constant communion with the great outdoors need someone to bring that vast domain to our desks and our evening lamp, and to keep alive in us, too often smothered, the natural impulse to get close to Mother Earth at every opportunity. Books such as yours and the distant view I have daily from my desk of snow-capped Mount Hood make my days at least endurable. The exhilarating impact of Muir's iconic descriptions deeply affected not only the everyday citizens of urbanizing America, but members of its most powerful economic and political elites, from the rural gentry of California to such figures as Edward Harriman, one of the most powerful railroad capitalists in the country. Muir received honorary degrees from Harvard and Yale, and consorted with a series of American presidents, most conspicuously Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, with whom he went camping in Yosemite, followed by journalists, and stood shoulder to shoulder for a famous photo on the edge of Glacier Point. Quote, "I do not want anyone with me but you," Roosevelt had beseeched Muir in the written invitation. "I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days and just be in the open with you." By then, of course, Muir had become a celebrity himself, a wiry, tall, slightly stooped figure leaning on a walking stick with an oversized baggy hat, gleaming eyes, bushy eyebrows, and, quote, "a public sort of beard," in the words of one of his biographers. A figure peering into the distant wilds of nature. I wish I had pictures for all this, but I wouldn't know how to put them on anyway. Such iconic power had significant material effect. That's my argument, of course. Most directly on the American presidents, like Roosevelt, who deployed state power to preserve nature's aesthetic beauty and moral purity, ordering the protection, funding, and permanent maintenance of a string of enormous national parks and forests. Describing Muir's writings as intertwined with his decades-long fight for preservation, the New York Times obituary published after his death depicted a relationship of cause and effect. Quote, "In 1989, Muir wrote a series of articles urging that a national reserve be created about Yosemite. In 1890, the reserve was created." More broadly, Muir's iconic performances were critical to crystallizing the growing movement to preserve wild nature against industrial society. They gave to Americans a new way to see and to feel. Quote, "For generations to come," the San Francisco Chronicle wrote in its obituary, "men and women who visit the mountains, streams, and forests of California will choose to see them through the eyes of John Muir." Muir's name became affixed to hundreds, if not thousands, of public buildings, schools, private enterprises, and pieces of California wilderness. In 2005, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the bodybuilder turned California Republican governor, announced that the California State Quarter issued by the US Mint would bear the imprint of, quote, "the naturalist and conservationist John Muir admiring Yosemite's Valley's monolithic half dome." But literary creation was not the only force that created iconic nature. Painted representations of nature created redolent material images which provided for an almost tactile experience of nature's surface and the moral depth beneath. It also popularized what literature had described in print. Nature writing had created extraordinary pictures in the mind's eye, but paintings and their etched or lithographic copies allowed audiences to, quote, "see for themselves." Not just in the mind's eye, in other words, but literally through their vision, their own eyes. Nature painting was a significant force in Europe, and artists in the Barbizon school like Theodore Rousseau, and in the Dusseldorf school like Karl Caspar Friedrichs were models for painters of nature in the US. Primed by literary background representations in European art, American painters became artist explorers. They materialized their own subjective experiences of nature and moved already primed citizen audiences to subjectify iconic nature in turn. Interestingly, visual artists were much less inclined than literary ones to insist that their work simply observed and transcribed nature is objectively luminous in all its qualities. Thomas Moran, for example, whose iconic depiction of Western canyons and mountains won great popular acclaim in the late 19th century, declared, quote, "I place no value upon literal transcriptions from nature, explaining my general scope is not realistic, and that all my tendencies are towards idealization." Asher Durant, whose mid-19th century painting helped define the Hudson River School, a famous early American school of painting, introduced the 6th issue of his influential Letters on Landscape Painting with the warning that, quote, "though we imagine that because we open our eyes, we see all that is before them, the artist must pass from the merely actual into the ideal of nature." And he detailed a series of painterly techniques that were required to transform a natural object into a textured canvas surface that would evoke nature's iconic power to an audience. A decade after Durant's letters, one of the most influential art critics in 19th century America, a person named James Jackson Jarves, explained that if the proper surface techniques were employed, then artistic performance could fuse artist, audience, and nature. Quote, "The effect of his art is to sink the artist and spectator into the scene such that the spectator is no longer a looker-on, but an inhabitant of the landscape." Now I'm going to move into my conclusion, but it will take a bit, so don't get too eager. Every material thing that enters into the social world must be signified. And signifying symbols become immensely more powerful when they are materialized. When meaning is materialized, people can experience it tactily as a sensuous surface. Nature had once been mundane and relatively meaningless, a means, not an end, an object principally fit for human exploitation. As it became sacralized, its surface came to be regarded rather instead as beautiful and sublime, and was experienced as an object of profound moral depth. Still material in an ontological sense, it now came to be experienced in an iconic rather than mundane manner. This transformation was not something inevitable, a matter of moral evolution, post-industrialism, or late or post-modernity. It was contingent, a new kind of iconic consciousness that had to be performed into being. Natural objects are not objectively beautiful or intrinsically moral. Audiences had to be persuaded to experience them that way. Philosophers, imaginative writers, explorers, painters, and photographers carefully crafted nature in iconic terms, aesthetically and morally, and projected these representations to audiences. Their shared ambition was to close the gap between nature and unresponsive human audiences by fusing readers, viewers, and would-be tourists with the natural icons encoded inside their images and texts. I'd argue that it was because their performances were successful that iconic nature became a new material feeling in the 20th century, a form of sacred experience that people determinately pursued, a newly imagined materiality that many tried doggedly to protect. It was not only large swaths of still wild nature that were covered with protective shields, like national parks and forests. In the midst of crowded urban areas, parks were inscribed, green spaces set apart from utilitarian pressure and dedicated to the aesthetic pleasure and enlightenment of citizens. Motorized urban roadways became lined with endless rows of cultivated street trees. Family homes were landscaped front and back with lawns, patches of green grass without utilitarian function. And children were sent to summer camps far away from urban parents so that they could experience the purity of nature before they entered adulthood. Such efforts to be always in purifying contact with a small patch of iconic nature were a steady and steadying pulse that beat in the life and limbs of contemporary societies. The sacrality of nature had not only to be experienced, however, it had also to be protected. And increasingly, that meant fighting not only against symbolic pollution, but it's increasingly in ominous material forms. By the middle of the 20th century, protecting nature from the materiality of pollution had become an urgent and widely shared social task. When experienced by large groups, the sublime can weld society together, David Nye once wrote. And the inverse is equally true. Threats to the sublime can weld large groups together, creating a powerful social force. From the miasma of terrors about smog and aerosols and oil spills, there emerged a protectionist movement as powerful as the labor-based movement against capitalist depredation that Karl Polanyi identified for the 19th century. It translated iconic nature into ideas like ecology and environment, and triggered a massive intellectual and social movement to keep natural sacrality from being polluted. Not biological material danger, but rather its threat to iconicity is what created environmentalism. Nature became widely sacralized, but its iconic power remained fiercely disputed, competing not only with the material interests and institutional forces of other social spheres, but with the discursive and iconic representations that embody the meaning of these other non-natural spheres, most conspicuously and most dangerously the worlds of economic production and consumption. The new struggle today over climate change is not only a matter of science, in other words, it is also a struggle to protect an icon whose sacrality, now conceived as planetary, is experienced as gravely endangered on a worldwide scale. Today, as over the last 2 centuries, the sacrality of nature has been continuously checked, if not checkmated. It has been nature's iconicity that has allowed it to hold its own. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I guess now, well, for our audience on YouTube, I think it's time to post your questions if you have ones, questions to the speakers, to the content of the lecture. And now during that time, we as discussants, as a member of workshop, we can start our replies, comments, and so on. Who wants to start?
I can start. Is that welcome? Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That's just a really impressive work. So I have 2 questions. One's conceptual, and one is about the historical dimension to the argument, which seems, a really important thread. So there's really 2 parts to that question, and the first part is about what precedes the epoch that you're describing. You reference to that there's a change that happens between, I guess, the 15 and the 1800s, or around the 1500s, and you describe that prior period as in sort of like more sort of materialist, pragmatic terms, where people are trying to get through or around a mountain. Nature is more of a direct challenge. It's a struggle. But I would assume that, that doesn't mean that it was not culturally constructed at that period, right? It seems like that is the sort of realism that you're disproving in the more modern period. And so, I mean, that's kind of an empirical question. I assume there's answers to that, but I wonder if you thought about that when you were sort of constructing representations of the prior imaginings of nature. And maybe the answers are in some of the texts that you were consulting. And then when we come forward into the present, so the second part of that historical question is, it sounds like the writers, these writers who were, through their performances of writing, and the painters, they were standing on the shoulders of figures like Wordsworth. There was a prior sort of cohorts of literary figures, other people already previously changing understandings of nature. And I'm wondering, like, this is the constant pressure with this type of work is, were the audience, how were the readers and the audiences also being sort of primed to make this turn as well? So that they were especially receptive to figures like Emerson or Thoreau. I mean, you really do show convincingly how much work they put into it, how skilled they were at it, and then also how popular they were. But, there's still, you also referenced that there were counter narratives and, counter forces coming out of other non-civil spheres. So I wonder if there's any, challenges in emphasizing the success of these figures over what it may have been, counter forces. And then the conceptual question is if you could speak a little bit about the difference between, what the concept icon adds that the term collective representation hasn't already exhausted. And I mean, I can see that it really it brings in materiality in a much more robust way, brings it to the fore. And it allows you to use this, this dynamic of talking about externalization and internalization, or I think you call it also like materialization and subjectivization. But would you agree that collective representations also involve that type of dynamic as well? Or not? Anyway, thank you though.
Oh, those are good points, Jason. I mean, I'll just do them in order. That they're in pre-industrial, pre-quote modern, even though I hate that term, but it's so widely used, it's impossible not to use it. I mean, there's a series of great literary, social, and culturalist geographers who have argued that there was this transformation, and that before 1500, nature was not symbolized as sacred. Of course, we go back before that to indigenous peoples. Of course, that it was. I mean, Durkheim's Aborigines. So there's a period after the decline in Europe, and I'm sure in other places in the world, but not in others, after the defeat or decline of indigenous peoples during the semi-productive, mostly farming periods of patrimonialism and feudalism, where most people live on the land in the West in a Christian society and do not regard nature as something to get enjoyment from by looking at or by walking inside of. So that's, of course, it has a language, and the language is, if I suggested, comes out in a way of the story of Genesis and the Garden of Eden, but it also comes from their own material circumstances, which is that they have to conquer nature. They have to exploit it They have to cut down trees. They have to get over mountains. And that's important in the drama of this chapter because it supplies the alternative point of view for what began to develop starting early. Because, for example, the Italian, the patricians who were the ruling class in the Italian city-states, they would have country homes. And I began the written version with a reference to an idyllic account of moving from the urbanized city out to the country home of an aristocrat. The second, yes, I mean, I'm careful, I think, at least in the written part, to say that not that the European romanticists, writers, philosophers, poets, and painters too, they preceded and accompanied these Americans I'm writing about. But in the minds of highly educated Americans among their audiences, this new language of romantic nature was there. But these three people I've talked about thought that Americans had not internalized this language, that America was, they felt a banal, commercial civilization of puritanical people who just wanted to work and make money and go about their business. And they saw the continent of the United States being gradually destroyed by this imperial civilization. So yes, the Europeans had created the beginnings of this language, and this was well understood by Emerson and others. But then Emerson and Thoreau became not the teachers of the United States, but Thoreau more broadly became read throughout the Western world as the person who created the iconic environmentalist, let's say. And Muir's writings were the trigger for the environmental conservation movement. So even though Europeans had begun to create the language of nature, that needed to be performed in the United States. And then it went back to Europe and other places who also conserved nature. This whole project of mine, in a way, grows out of, I accept completely the notion of collective representations, but I see from Durkheim, because Durkheim's elementary forms created the basis of cultural sociology, but collective representations, by embedding collective representations in ritual, Durkheim didn't develop the conceptual apparatus to understand the difficulty of communicating representations to audiences as you have social and cultural differentiation. So that's one thing. And you know that because you and I developed that alternative to Durkheim together in our work on performances. So I don't believe at all that Durkheim is sufficient. I think that you need Weber, you need pragmatism and others to bring Durkheimian insights to bear on the complexity of modern or contemporary life. But in addition, there's a problem of materiality. Now, in Durkheim's work, he understood that collective representations had to be embedded in totems. And he has some passages about that, so he understood that. But he tells us almost nothing about totems. And of course, totems aren't actors for him. They aren't forces for him. And one of the reasons is that Durkheim, I would argue, has had no understanding of the role of aesthetics. There's some people who claim he did, but my feeling is that Durkheim was a Kantian and a moralist and never went to an art museum in his life, despite the fact that he was an inhabitant of Paris in his greatest artistic time. So I tried to bring in my theory of icons aesthetics into the center and argue that it's the aesthetics is a way of understanding what appeals to the senses, and it's a way for us to understand forms and style and how they try to compel a sensuous attachment to, if you want, totemic or material objects. Durkheim understood the moral or the discursive part, which I put as a depth meaning, and I want to add the sensuous surface.
Okay, thank you. Daniel?
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was really great. The thing that I was interested in a lot with your paper was the way in which you take great care over how much of this is an aesthetic construction, and that you treat them as artists. But if you look at who is leading kind of ecological movements, and especially like the kind of legacy of this like nature is healing idea, it's often scientists. And I was wondering how far, in your view or anyone else's view, these scientists are still, properly speaking, heirs to Thoreau or Emerson, because they're not as cultured, they're not as concerned with aesthetic questions. How are they mobilizing our response to ecological crises, or even modern city life, say, in the way that they were?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, Daniel. I mean, there's two kinds of, with the movement of environmentalism, which takes place more or less in the 50s. I mean, it begins among some scientific circles before, but with the notions of ecology, environment, are really the scientific product of the movements that I've described in the 19th century, getting translated into a scientific interest and attention and the development of these concepts. But since then, there's kind of two discourses about the environmental crisis. I mean, there's a lot more than two, but the scientific discourse is a valid one, but it's factual. Simply in itself, it's factual. And then there's the iconic argument about the destruction of the environment. Both they intertwine, though, and often in statements by scientists, they always, I would say, are intertwined with at least a moral rhetoric of imperative, obligation, sadness, fear, lots of things like that. So, but they're weak. These, in a scientific, so the UN, creates these experts in the issue, these things, but the very precision of science, denudes it of rhetoric. They can't say a date when the world's going to be destroyed. They can't say the world will be destroyed. They say certain things will happen, et cetera, et cetera. Although one could study the gradual change in scientific rhetoric as it's become informed by more rhetorical and aesthetic kinds of apocalyptic ideas. But for example, one of the first great ecologists in the United States was a woman named Rachel Carson, who was a very accomplished biologist, oceanic biologist, whose book about the effect of the poison DDT used as a fertilizer, as a pest control, aroused for the first time a big movement here. It was called The Silent Spring. So you have this very evocative, poetic title, and her book is based on science, but it's also written as a very moving kind of argument. So, Phil Smith wrote a book about 10 years ago, co-wrote a book, whose premise was that global warming warnings haven't had enough of a dramatic effect. And he tried to understand why that was in terms of overly scientificness, in a way, that this hadn't reached at that time deep into the hearts of people.
I saw Pavel's hand, or probably I missed somebody else.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So Pavel,
Yes.
you...
Wonderful. Thanks. Thank you. I enjoyed the paper a lot, actually, and I think I learned a lot about Thoreau, for instance, that I didn't know also. And I liked how in the conclusion you kind of open up the discussion to many empirical instances of sort of nature in the current civilization, let's say. And I was wondering if precisely in the conclusion, if some of the empirical cases could also be read differently or in a different way. I was thinking specifically about the urban parks that you mentioned and the sort of private gardens, which I think that in the history of European cities, most of them, the sort of chief concern, the sort of rationale behind building these parks was not so much in the nature itself, but in the health of the workers who were actually, it was thought that if workers have to spend their time in the factory, it would be a good idea to give them the opportunity to go to a park on Sunday. So it was, in a sense, it was not so much a statement on the sort of intrinsic value of nature, but rather on the, that we are natural creatures and we need nature for our well-being, for our physical well-being. So in a sense, you could also read this as a sort of utilitarian gesture as well, that the parks are there for our sort of instrumentally for our sort of good, which it's probably a tiny difference from what you were saying, but I think it also echoes kind of in the environmental discourse of today, where, since you mentioned it also in the paper, where of course you have the sort of refrain of the environmental discourse today that the planet is in danger. But there are groups which are kind of arguing, let's not present it like the planet is in danger. It's not the planet which is in danger. It's us who are in danger. The planet will be fine. It's actually about us who are in danger. So I think this is sort of similar split to what I thought was there in your paper, that there is the urban parks are there for the good of the nature, but they are also utilitarian in a sense.
Yeah, that's a subtle and interesting point. Utilitarian arguments are always built on certain goods being already valued. Like a critique of George Hohmann's exchange and rational choice theory I made back in 20 lectures in '87 was precisely that you can't assess the greatest good to the greatest number without a cultural definition of what good objects are. So perhaps it's simply a matter of workers' health is a good object, which is itself, of course, a socially produced and pretty radical moral idea. And if that is why urban parks were introduced throughout Europe, then that wouldn't just be utilitarian. It would have a cultural sociology and inside of it. But then I also think that the idea that nature would be good for people, you have to have nature symbolized as a purifying icon. I don't think that people in, the year 800 would have thought that going out into nature would be good for workers. Of course, they didn't have industrial civilization, but the idea that nature was a restorative experience wasn't available. So since I don't know anything about what you're saying empirically, I can only kind of think about it theoretically and think that the example you provided does gesture towards the symbolization of the kind of symbolization of nature that I've talked about here. Now, in the United States, that was not the dominant argument for making parks. It was very much an argument to bring nature from the wild into an urban network. And of course, American parks like Central Park are wild compared to maybe, a British or French park. But so that would be my response to what you're saying. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Andrea?
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Very interesting. And I guess I just have two comments. I'll try to keep them brief so everyone waiting gets a chance. The first is following up what Jason said about, what was happening before. Something that I thought of, and maybe you've already thought about this and put it away, is the difference, this distinction between the wild and the pastoral. And so if you think colonial to revolutionary times in the United States, the kind of Southern gentry taking ownership of the pastoralness and celebrating the pastoralness of the American South. And as opposed to this kind of industrial North, where farming really couldn't take off. And so in the 1850s, then you have the emergence of a celebration of the wild, is the way I really think of this. So not just nature, but untamed nature. And so I wonder if that might help the front end of your story a little bit. And then the second thing is a little bit about what happens after this. And I just, in terms of the performance aspects of iconicity. And I happened to do a classic American thing a few summers ago, and I spent 7 weeks in my car with my family driving around to the American national parks. And what I was very struck by, for example, at Yellowstone National Park and some of these other Grand Canyon and all of these, iconic parks, is how managed and performed the park is, and how that as a person who goes to these parks, you are really, there's nothing natural about them. It's in fact a really established experience where you pay money and you go out on your horses on a trail ride and go to a cowboy night around the fire, and you stay in these lodges that are, it's a really maintained space. And so I do think it would be interesting to follow up and think about how does nature as becomes this icon in terms of these parks really get maintained and performed. So those are just a couple of comments.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. I mean, that's to begin with the second point. I mean, this is a tension in everybody who writes about about preservation of nature in the, in a capitalist and mass culture society. So I forget the name of this guy who wrote a really fascinating book, How the Grand Canyon Became Grand. Talks about that by the time of the 1880s, when the Grand Canyon had finally fully become a national icon embodying all sorts of things, it became, he argues, so completely commodified that special train was built for people to come from places, that there were hotels nearby. And he sees this as undermining the purity of nature. I don't accept this view of commodification. I think that commodification, it has its dangers, but what it generally does is distribute iconic qualities to people. I'm going to write a chapter. One of the last chapters I have to do in this book is about that. So while you, as a very wise and cynical sociologist, see the national parks as destroying the experience of nature through performativity, it could also be argued that the performativity to the unsophisticated nature enthusiast is what makes it available.
Yeah, just really quickly, I'm actually not cynical, but I just think it is part of what the park is.
Oh,
right?
I think
that experience is to go there and to do those things and to be a part of the scene, as you were saying.
I agree.
And that's really part of the structure of the parks. But anyway,
that it is very highly performative, the parks, and this does have a problem because it brings so many people in, and there's this kind of dialectic of immersion and then destruction and then re-emergence and things like that. The pastoral and the wild, I mean, I wanted to get away from that distinction and would think that each is a refraction of iconic nature. One more civilized, the pastoral, and offering a kind of calmness of purification, the other being more primitive, more dangerous, and more exciting. So it's a difference between hiking in the woods and climbing a mountain, let's say, or climbing a mountain with ropes and climbing a mountain without ropes. And I think, but it is an important one. But the pastoral is, as you know, a literary genre that starts really in the 1500s and just pervades European and American literature. And there's not that many wild things as a literary genre. There are, though, some.
Okay, thank you very much. We have actually two questions from YouTube, and I don't know if you are okay, we can answer those two questions now, or are you okay? Are you not hurrying? So the first question is from Daniel Molericona Alfaro. Sorry if I read it incorrectly, correct me please. So the question is, would you say that this sacredness of nature is fueled by an indigenous global discourse structure in the last decades? This indigenous discourse that points the relation with nature as something sacred, something to defend. And for example, indigenous president Evo Morales in Bolivia, he's putting special emphasis on Pachamama, which is what means motherland, arguing that Pachamama or death in the United Nations General Assembly.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. I think I hadn't thought of that, and I think you should write your PhD dissertation on that. Yeah, I mean, indigenous movements go back before the banalization of nature as not sacred, as I said, in the beginning of the question period with Jason. They go back to early tribal, magical civilizations of totemism, let's just say, the kind that Durkheim talks about in the elementary forms. And so I suppose, it's clear that indigenous movements, which are now pretty significant politically and economically, they add a different political message to the language of sacralization. And they build then, they claim, of course, that Western societies have desacralized nature, and that the indigenous people are the ones who sacralize nature. That's not true. The success of these movements partly depends on them being welcomed as another example or movement that sacralizes nature. Of course, their understanding of sacred nature is connected to spirits and religious figures that are not the same as the kind of 19th and 20th century and 21st century sacralization narratives of the Western world.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the second YouTube question is by Nita. It says, thank you for the great lecture and inspiring ideas. And there are two things I would like to ask. If I understood right, the iconic performance is a result of post-production of nature and natural objects. But can this iconic performance be detached from object it criticizes? How the link between natural objects and their performance can be saved? And will the object be the same, or this link is destroyed? An empirical example of such situation can be decorative facades that have nothing in common with the structure of the building. And if returned to the idea which was developed following Emerson, that form follow function, if the form of iconic object changes, will be the same or it will be completely different? I posted it in the chat.
Maybe I'll have to look at that for a second.
Yeah, because it's a bit long.
It's kind of, I don't think the question is fully fleshed out, but it's very, very thought-provoking. The most important response I'd make is that the representations pictorially, which I believe that this question is referencing in terms of not writing, but representations are always separated from the objects. Representations in writing and in photography, painting, movies, drawings, etc. So there's never an identity of this. In fact, the aesthetic part requires creativity and agency. And so it's supposed to be a striking aesthetic representation, but not the image itself. So in that sense, it doesn't destroy the image. The object, it's supposed to draw it out in a compelling way. And I think you'd see in any photograph of nature, it's distortive, if you want, in terms of realism. But in fact, there is no real representations of nature. It's impossible because there are always representations with a certain kind of light and darkness, shot from a certain height, looking at it from a point of view. Even when you go into the forest, let's say yourself, you can't see it as it really is. You're seeing it from a certain perspective. So we know we give to the object a kind of ontological reality. We grant that entirely, but the representations of the object, the iconic representations, are always separated from that. I don't know what the form and function argument means, but I do have some thoughts about that. I mean, the modernist movement, which invented the term form follows function, argued that the aesthetic surfaces of buildings should not be decorative, but should reflect the actual construction materials and the engineering of the building itself. So probably most of you know, like the Pompidou Center in France, that you go and you see pipes running around, electrical cords, all the scaffolding. It's as if the inside came outside. Or you could even look at the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower, which wasn't designed in order by a modernist, but it became a symbol of modernism because its form is its function. Or let's just put it this way. Its function is its form. It was built by Eiffel, the most famous civil engineer of his time, without any regard for traditional aesthetics. And it was hated by most French people. But then it gradually became a symbol of a modernist form follows function. But I think it's naive to think that we can see a form, we can see a function. The idea of the industrial functioning was always mediated by aesthetic conventions and by moral rhetoric about the greatness of industrial civilization. I mean, this is too long to go into, but the idea of form follows function is a kind of reductive, narrow ideology propagated by architectural performances to justify the aesthetics of modernism. How that applies to nature, I'm not sure I could say. I mean, it's very parallel to what I'm talking about here.
Okay, thank you very much. Trygve?
Hi. Thank you for this wonderful session and a great talk and a great read. I want to just quickly echo Jason and Andrea, I think. As I read on page 3, Jeff was quoting Hepburn, "The fall of an autumn leaf with the mute message of summer gone. It's symbolizing all falling, our own including," which is just, I mean, absolutely wonderful. And it got me thinking about, existential dilemmas. And I wondered if nature or parts of nature was also iconic before the historical period you were describing, Jeff. But I think you have talked about this already. So I guess my question today is tied to sort of some debates that are going on in Norway and elsewhere. We're seeing environmentalists today arguing that we need to build sustainable power plants, and building these power plants sometimes destroying or at least changing nature. For example, in the form of windmills. We're having these huge windmills, debates about windmills. And the argument is that we have to do this to save nature, to save save our planet and so on. We sort of need to sacrifice nature and ecosystems to save nature, to save the planet. I want to tie this sort of reflection to something you note on page 37. You mentioned civil sphere theory. And I wonder, what potentials do you see in combining civil sphere theory and ideas about iconic nature? I guess this is also a question about how the attribution of design, which I think is, just wonderful, how the attribution of design intersects with criticism, which was a big part of the other paper that we read.
Oh, yeah, this really good points to think about. I mean, in terms of my arguments about pre-1500 Europe, I would advise you guys to take a look at 3 books. Well, really 2. The Marjorie Hope Nicholson's book, which is, what is the name of the book? I don't have the footnotes here, but which is considered to be a transformational landmark in literary histories of land and nature. And also Keith Thomas's giant book about that. These are claims that are widely accepted. These are historical versions, narratives that are widely accepted. Maybe they're wrong, but they seem to be true. I mean, the point about windmills is great because, my reaction has always been those windmills are beautiful. And that what people need to argue is that windmills are, especially the giant windmills, the wind turbines are one of the great new aesthetic objects of an environmental society, and that we shouldn't see them as destroying nature. But that's not an easy argument to make right now. Because everybody's opposing them on the grounds you explained that it's a desecration of nature. The thing is, as long as, and then it's mostly court ordering. I mean, here's the court forces, it's compulsion, that, or capitalist companies, outside the 3-mile or 10-mile limits do it. And it's been very hard to generate iconic performances that justify large wind turbines. It's more like we're doing this for nature, and scientists combined with federal governments and courts to force there to be wind turbines, or capitalist companies who will make a lot of money from it. But I think eventually these turbines could become thought of as complementary to the beauty of an ocean or rocky mountains going up into the sky. And I predict they will be. I'm not sure about the civil sphere thing. I mean, in the United States, nature was always considered to be a representation of the uniqueness of the United States, because the United States was wild and untamed, quote unquote. The Aboriginal Indians were completely ignored, although eventually they became icons of this wild and untameness after their civilizations were destroyed. And there were famous painters who painted the noble Indian and stories about the noble Indian, but American intellectuals and political leaders and artists thought that the wildness of North America was what made America innocent, whereas in Europe, nature was being pastoralized. And this gets back to Andrea's point. And Europe was corrupt. It had aristocracies. It didn't have wild nature, whereas the United States was what was called a virgin land, unsullied, where you could have a new experiment in democracy and freedom. I mean, in a way, the people like Emerson and Thoreau and Muir are critics, that they are people who tell us what objects are. They dispute other arguments about nature and things like that. And there's not a complete direct connection between the Swedish essay and this essay, but I think that the overlap is that objects are performative. They're created. Even with natural objects, style is an attribution that's important, and that people have to be connected to that there's a whole machinery of performativity in Andrea's sense to connect objects to audiences.
Okay, thank you very much. Alica?
Thank you, and thank you for a great lecture. I'm very happy I could be here with you today. I'm Alica Rajtiova from the Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. I just felt I should introduce myself, as probably most of you don't know me. Many was said already and asked, but I was thinking all the time about the religious discourse of Christianity. And my question is, to what extent would you say that this birth of a modern, as you call it, modern environmental imagination, this huge transformation that you are talking about, was also produced by this discourse of Christianity, nature as something that should be protected because it's God's creation. And I was thinking, because this is, I perceived it as a very strong argument that this birth of this environmental imagination that is very modern is a product of these actor authors, right? Of poets. But I was just wondering, like, if it hasn't blended with more discourses, or would you say that it happened after it was born already? I don't know if it is understandable. If not, I can elaborate more.
No, it's perfectly understandable. And I mean, Emerson was a very religious person, but he was more of a mystical, spiritual person. So, I mean, all of these writings are permeated by small r religiosity. But Muir, for example, was, a convention, was both a mystic in the sense I mentioned, but also a deep believer in the Christian God. And he thought exactly what you're saying, that God created all of the things that he described. So there was a change in Christianity between the years I'm talking about, 1500 really to 1900. There was the earlier Christian banalization of nature and the justification for exploitation was transformed as part of this. I mean, very gradually, but very significantly. So the idea that God created nature so it shouldn't be defoliated is now a very strong argument among many groups.
Okay, thank you. Dmitry, you have questions, comments?
Yeah, except if you have your own, because I think we only have 8 minutes.
Okay.
And I would sacrifice myself for the sake of yours, because I think I might have already asked versions of it, of what I'm having in mind, Jeff. So let's go with yours, unless you don't want.
Yeah, let's start with yours. I mean,
Okay. Then this is an old question. I think Jeff had already answered some versions of it, but I think it makes sense to ask it and to hear the answer. So I think it's perfectly convincing that that iconic theory kind of prevents this material reductionism. And this particular case shows perfectly well that material objects do not create meanings by themselves, even when it seems so. So, but if we, for example, if we take this Durkheimian mise-en-scène of the elementary form from the elementary forms, and we can say that there are, of course, those sacred places are arbitrary. So the society kind of makes the place sacred, and it could be a hill and it could be a flat place. But we know that the hill is more likely to become a sacred place, just probably because there are of the simple principle of perspectives. You can see this place from different places, from distance. And so what I'm talking about is that materiality, even though it is not create meanings by itself, there are a lot of examples could be given that it kind of participates in meaning making. And the question is how iconic theory could make an account for that. And I think it's what Immanuel Kant, you mentioned in your paper, the argument that Immanuel Kant makes after work about the sublime. And Kant writes that when you experience in the sea, and it is so much larger than yourself that you cannot not to feel this feeling of sublime against that, because it's so much dominating you, it's so much larger than you. And it's again an example how materiality gets into, of course, not creating meanings by itself, but, or the last example, just to make it from the different angle. Well, we are now performing a kind of tea ceremony, and it's, of course, it's full of meanings, and even the taste we experience is shaped by the meanings and by the systems of meanings. But if we were drinking wine instead of tea, it could be slightly different. Why? Because although it would be still intertwined with systems of meanings, and even the shape of the glass would matter, there was still one factor there. The alcohol would affect our brains, and it would be part of the performance. It would be part of the taste, and it would be part of our experience. So what strategy the iconic theory has to make an account for such things, when material objects or materiality in different ways kind of participates in meaning making?
I mean, this is, I think that in the current climate, intellectual climate, we're way over, we're giving way too much weight to the impact of materiality, as, for example, Gibson's idea of affordances, the discourse by Latour, and he has his American variations. So, I mean, Kant and Burke are just completely wrong. They're completely wrong. You have to understand this. They're materialistic. They claim that the structure of the mountain and the vastness, they're making this thing form, material form impacts on the senses and gives us a feeling of the sublime. But intellectual and cultural historians have shown that the very idea of the sublime is a social construction that comes out of the kinds of developments that I've discussed here. That the sublime was a characteristic of God before, but not of mountains. And Burke came up with these ideas before Kant, but I mean, I think that, materiality in its, time and space and its shapes is significant, but I want to really push back against it. And I want to say that materiality, I'm not saying that it doesn't exist in time and space, and that has a powerful effect. But what social science is concerned about, as Dilthey used to argue, is not that generally, but with the aesthetic and moral experience of materiality. And that when we touch things, when we go through buildings, and when we're in nature, and when we pass people on the street, etc., that it's this experience, the iconic experience, that is the most important thing. So I'm not sympathetic to the idea of giving, that we have to give materiality an equal role in constituting our experience. What I think generally is that, for example, Kant and Burke were already so reconstructed by the cultural movements in Europe that I'm talking about here, that they thought that mountains were sublime, but they weren't. Mountains are just pieces of earth. They have no sublimity.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about Burke, though Kant has a slightly different argument. He kind of see the source of the sublime in the interaction between a mountain or a sea and a person and a perception, so it's slightly different. And I didn't mean that it would be equally important.
No.
But even if it is secondary, but is it possible somehow to fit it into the theory as a secondary?
I think what we have to do is we have to acknowledge that the experience of material things is vital, and that we live our lives, we feel inside of material things like wine versus tea, like Bordeaux versus Burgundy, Chablis versus Chardonnay, high mountains versus hills, that's how we live our life, beauty and lack of beauty, etc. And that material experience is gigantically significant, but it's not an experience of the thing in itself. That's where I would come down on that.
Thank you. Any other questions, Jason?
I think I'm going to have to get off.
Yeah.
Because I do have an appointment, and I'm running out of steam here. So I'm not really, I could go on forever, but I'll just say that thanks for all of your responses. It's really exciting to be able to be talking with Moscow, with Norway, with all sorts of different places. It's great. So I think that from my point of view, this was a great inaugural occasion.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everyone who attended, and to everyone who were watching us on YouTube and posting the comments. And we will have an announcement of the next seminar, I think. So we will send an email And that's it. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
so
See you
Thanks, everyone.
soon.
Bye.
Все уже?
Да, что, мне кажется, все.
Стрим остановили, да?
Да.
Простите, у меня мы уже.
Все.
Мы все видим и слышим, Настя, еще.
Да, все хорошо.
Сразу же Тамара включается. Мышка.
Так, ну, наверное, нам тоже надо выйти, да? Или Тамара?